The night was cold, and the streets were almost eerily quiet. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was a little past midnight. It had been a slow shift so far, but that was about to change. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence inside the patrol car. Dispatch came through, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. Unit 12, we've got a disturbance call on Elm Street. Neighbor reports strange noises coming from the old Sycamore house. Can you check it out? I glanced at Smith, my partner, who'd been staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. He caught my eye and shrugged. Let's go see what it's about, he said, his voice betraying a hint of unease. I understood why. The Sycamore house had a reputation, a place where kids dared each other to go at night, but no one ever stayed for long. It had been abandoned for years, yet there were always stories, whispers of something unnatural inside. As we pulled up to the house, the headlights cut through to the darkness, revealing the old, decaying structure. It loomed before us, the windows dark, like empty, soulless eyes. The wind rustled the leaves, making them whisper secrets we weren't supposed to hear. We got out of the car, and the moment my feet hit the pavement, I felt it. A chill that seeped into my bones, the kind that didn't come from the weather. I shot a glance at Smith. He was trying to act casual, but I could see it. His hand hovered a bit too close to his holster, and his eyes kept darting around, scanning the shadows. You ready? I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Yeah, let's get this over with, he muttered. We approached the front door, the wood swollen and cracked with age. I reached out, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. The knob turned with ease, and the door creaked open, the sound echoing down the empty street. Inside it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow up the light from our flashlights. As we stepped inside, the smell hit me first, thick, musty, with a hint of something rotten. Dust hung in the air, sparkling in the beams of our flashlights, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. We moved through the house, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water and the faint rustling of something unseen. Then we heard it, a low, mournful moan coming from somewhere upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I felt Smith tense beside me. You hear that? I whispered. Yeah, I heard it, he replied, his voice barely audible. We stood there for a moment, listening. The moan came again, this time clearer, as if whatever was making it was closer. We exchanged a look, and I could see the same question in his eyes that was in my mind. What the hell was that? We moved slowly, cautiously, through the living room, past the dusty furniture and cobwebs that clung to the ceiling. Every step felt like it was taking us deeper into the unknown. We reached the staircase, and I hesitated, looking up into the darkness. The moan came again, louder this time, echoing down the stairs. I took a deep breath and started to climb, the wooden steps groaning under my boots. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long, narrow hallway. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. My breath came out in misty puffs. The moan echoed again, and it was coming from the last room on the left. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to peek through. Smith nudged me, and I nodded. We approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the sweat on my palms, and I wiped them on my pants, trying to steady my hands. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, almost. In the corner there was a rocking chair, and it was moving, slowly, back and forth. There was no one in the chair, and yet it swayed, creaking softly with each motion. The moaning stopped as soon as we stepped inside, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed down on us. Smith and I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight on the chair, half expecting to see someone hiding behind it. But there was nothing, just an empty room with a chair that wouldn't stop moving. I was about to say something, maybe suggest we leave and call for backup, when the chair abruptly stopped. The sudden stillness made my skin crawl, and then, out of nowhere, a cold wind whipped through the room. It was strong enough to blow out Smith's flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. I heard him curse, fumbling to turn it back on, and that's when I felt it. A hand, ice cold, resting on my shoulder. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no one there. I could hear Smith's ragged breathing beside me, and when he managed to get his flashlight back on, his face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," he said, and I didn't argue. We practically ran down the stairs, not bothering to be quiet anymore. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. We made it to the front door, and as I reached out to open it, I heard it again. That moan, but this time it wasn't coming from inside the house. It was behind me, right next to my ear, so close that I could feel the breath on my neck. I didn't look back. I grabbed the door, yanked it open, and we stumbled outside, gasping for air. The night seemed to close in around us, and for a moment I felt like I was suffocating. We got back in the car, slammed the doors shut, and I didn't realize how hard my hands were shaking until I tried to start the engine. We drove back to the station in silence. Neither of us spoke, but I knew we were thinking the same thing. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't human. I've been on the force for over 15 years, and I've seen a lot of things, but nothing ever shook me like that night. I don't know what was in the Sycamore house, and I don't want to find out. But sometimes, late at night, when the station is quiet, and I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still hear that moan echoing in the back of my mind, reminding me that there are things out there that can't be explained, things that are better left alone. I've been an officer for 5 years, seen my share of strange things out here, on these long, empty highways that stretch for miles between one speck of civilization and another. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that night. You might hear about things like this on those late-night radio shows, or from some guy in a bar who swears up and down he's telling the truth. You never expect it to happen to you. But now, every time I get in my patrol car and take off down the highway at dusk, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, watching. It was a Tuesday night, just after midnight, the kind of night where the world feels dead, except for the occasional truck roaring by, headlights cutting through the black like knives. I was doing my rounds, driving the stretch of road I knew better than my own apartment. It was quiet. Too quiet. Just the hum of the engine and the chatter of static from the radio, nothing more. I was about halfway through my patrol when I saw it, a figure in the rear-view mirror. At first I thought it might be an animal. A lot of deer come out this time of night. But no, this wasn't wildlife. It was human, or at least, it looked human. I slowed down, eyes glued to the mirror. There it was again, just off the shoulder of the road, walking through a thick fog that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I don't remember seeing any fog earlier. It was strange. This stretch of highway rarely saw people, especially at this hour. Maybe it was a hitchhiker, lost or hurt. But something about the way they moved, it wasn't right. I pulled over, my headlights slicing through the fog like paper. The figure came into view, but only slightly. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, thin, with a long dark garment that fluttered in the wind like it had a life of its own. I felt a chill work its way down my spine, something primal warning me to stay in the car. But I didn't listen. I rolled down the window, leaning out just a bit. "Excuse me, sir. Are you all right? Do you need assistance?" My voice echoed in the quiet. Swallowed by the fog, the figure stopped walking but didn't turn around. It just stood there. My unease deepened. "Sir, I need you to turn around and show me your hands." Nothing. I opened the door, the heavy thunk of it against the silence making me wince. Something about the air felt wrong, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees the second I stepped out. My hand hovered near my holster. I wasn't expecting trouble, but every instinct screamed at me to be ready for something. I took a step forward, calling out again, "Sir, I need to see your hands." Still no response. Just the thickening fog swirling around that motionless figure. And then, slowly, too slowly, it began to turn. What I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my life. The figure didn't have a face, not in the sense that it was hidden or obscured, but there was just nothing. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just an empty, featureless void. I froze, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't move. I couldn't. It was as if my legs had turned to stone, rooting me to the spot. Fear, the kind of raw, primal fear I hadn't felt since I was a kid, gripped me tight. The figure tilted its head, as if it were curious, and took a step toward me. I don't know why, but my hand lifted, not to grab my weapon, but as if I were trying to stop it, pleading silently for it to stay back. My body moved without my consent, like something else had taken over, guiding me through the motions. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift. The figure, it just vanished. 1 second, it was there, looming over me, faceless and terrifying, and the next, gone. No sound, no trace, nothing but the cold night air and the pounding of my heart. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? No. It was too real, too vivid to be a trick of the mind. I'd seen it, felt it. I finally forced myself to move, to look around, but there was no sign of anything. Just the quiet stretch of road, the fog lifting as if it had never been there. I don't remember getting back into the car, but the next thing I knew, I was sitting behind the wheel, staring blankly at the dashboard, my hands trembling. I should have radioed it in, called for backup, done something. But I didn't. I couldn't. I finished my patrol that night, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the faceless figure walking behind me again. But it never came back. Days passed, then weeks. I never told anyone about what I saw. Who would believe me? Even now, when I think back on it, I question my own sanity. But I know what I saw that night. It wasn't human. And sometimes, when I'm out on that stretch of highway, late at night, I still feel it. That cold, creeping sensation that someone, or something, is watching me from the shadows, waiting. It was supposed to be just another night shift. Long, dull, and uneventful. That's how I preferred it. The fewer surprises, the better. I was halfway through my 3rd cup of lukewarm coffee when the call came in. Public intoxication, nothing special. A man was brought in, stumbling, barely able to stand, mumbling incoherently to himself. Officer Thompson and I escorted him to the cell. We exchanged a few jokes about it, the usual banter to make the hours pass quicker. I didn't think much of it at the time. How could I know what was coming? The guy, maybe in his late 30s, looked rough. Greasy hair, pale skin, dark circles under his eyes. As we processed him, he kept his head down, swaying on his feet. It wasn't until we locked him up that I really noticed how hollow he seemed. Empty, like the light had been sucked out of him. Thompson noticed it too. I could tell by the way he kept glancing at the cell. He was quiet at first, just pacing, muttering under his breath. Typical behavior for someone too drunk to function. But after a while, something changed. His murmurs grew louder, more frantic. He'd pause, clutching the bars, staring down the corridor like he was expecting something. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself he was just some junkie having a bad trip. But there was something in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. Fear, real, gut-wrenching fear. "He's here. He's coming for me," he kept saying, over and over, his voice cracking, barely audible. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I forced a laugh. "Yeah, buddy, I bet he is," I said, rolling my eyes. Thompson shot me a look, the kind that said he wasn't finding any of this funny. That's when the screaming started. It wasn't a normal scream. It was raw, desperate, like an animal caught in a trap. Thompson and I rushed to the cell, but when we got there, we just froze. The guy was thrashing around, his limbs twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible, like his bones were rubber. His eyes, wide open, were glowing, an unnatural, sickly yellow. I swear to God it felt like they were burning into my soul. "Help me," he begged, but it didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like a command. His voice was all wrong, deeper, almost guttural. Thompson took a step back, and I could see the terror in his eyes. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat was dry. I could barely breathe. The other officers must have heard the commotion because they came running. We stood there, a cluster of uniforms, watching this guy twist and contort, hissing at us like a cornered animal. "You cannot hold me," he growled, his voice resonating in a way that made my bones ache. "I belong to the shadows." The words echoed, bouncing off the walls, but it felt like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. There was a coldness in the air, a chill that seeped into my bones, and the room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I glanced at the other officers, their faces pale, eyes wide with the same dread I felt gnawing at my insides. I'd seen fear before, but this was different. This was primal, a terror that grabbed you by the throat and wouldn't let go. Thompson was the first to speak. "Sir, it's okay. We're here to help you. Just calm down," he said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. The man didn't respond. He just kept writhing, his mouth contorting into a grotesque grin. His eyes, now slits of yellow, flickered like a flame caught in the wind. And then, just like that, he went silent. Dead silent. His body went limp, and he slumped against the bars, his head hanging low. We stood there, waiting, not sure what to expect. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding like a drum in my ears. For a moment I thought it was over. But then he moved. Slowly, almost lazily, he lifted his head, and I swear to God, the thing that looked back at us wasn't human. Those eyes, cold, reptilian, brimming with an ancient, unspeakable malice. And the grin, that goddamned grin, like he knew something we didn't, something terrible. "You will all serve," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper, but it echoed through the station, rattling in my skull. My legs felt weak. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. And then it got worse. The cell door rattled, shaking like something was trying to rip it off its hinges. I could feel the vibrations under my feet, could hear the metal groaning under the strain. Thompson stepped forward, hand hovering over his gun, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. I don't know why I said it. I just knew that whatever was happening, drawing a weapon wasn't going to help. The man's body jerked violently, and he collapsed to the floor, limbs splayed out at unnatural angles. We waited, holding our breath, but he didn't move again. The cell was still, and the chill in the air began to fade. For a long moment, no one spoke. We just stood there, staring at the motionless figure crumpled on the ground. It was Thompson who broke the silence. "Get him out of there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I could see his hands shaking, but he forced himself to move. We opened the cell door and two of the guys pulled the man out. His body was limp, but there was a tension, a coiled energy beneath the surface, like he was just waiting to snap back to life. I wanted to get as far away from him as possible, but I couldn't look away. They dragged him to the infirmary, and I followed, every step feeling heavier than the last. When the medics arrived, they checked his vitals, their faces tight with confusion. They said he was alive, but barely. They asked what happened, but none of us had an answer. How could we explain what we saw? As they wheeled him out, I caught one last glimpse of his face. His eyes were closed, but his lips were curled into that same sinister grin. It wasn't over. I could feel it, like a dark cloud hanging over us, waiting. I haven't been able to sleep since that night. I keep hearing his voice, echoing in the dark, reminding me of something I can't quite grasp. And every time I close my eyes, I see those yellow, burning eyes staring back at me, promising something terrible, something I know deep down hasn't left that cell. Not really.